Hi, everyone. Welcome to Dean's Chat, where we discuss all things podiatric medicine. My name is Dr. Jeffrey Jensen. I'm your host and the Dean of the Arizona College of Podiatric Medicine. My guest today, Dr. Jason Hanft, is from Miami, Florida. He is the CEO and founder of Defender Operations. I've known Dr. Hanft for a long time, and if you asked me to describe him in 6 words, they would be the following. Number 1, leader. Number 2, innovator. Number 3, inventor. Number 4, entrepreneur. Number 5, researcher. And number 6, educator. And hopefully we'll talk about all of these throughout the podcast today. Dr. Hanft graduated from the Illinois College of Podiatric Medicine in 1988. He completed his surgical residency training at Larkin General Hospital under the leadership of Dr. Keith Kashik, who was a true icon in our profession. Welcome to Dean's Chat, Dr. Hanft.
Thank you for having me, Jeff. I appreciate it.
No, thank you for joining us. You know, Jason, in keeping with the Dean's Chat, fireside chat theme, I try to go a little more informal, and let's just go by first names, Jason and Jeff, throughout the discussion today.
Sounds good to me.
All right. So to get started, can you just tell us a little bit about yourself and a little bit about your family?
Well, I'm a lifetime podiatrist. I started in the podiatry field at 9 years of age. I have had the pleasure of working with or for some of the leaders in our field, and the opportunities provided me through becoming a podiatrist have been pretty amazing. And additionally, I am married to a podiatrist who runs a clinical research business, and is also board certified and was a quite active surgeon for a number of years. And we have 2 teenagers and a college sophomore, all boys.
Oh my God, busy times for the Hanft family.
Absolutely, but fun times.
Great. You touched on something right away that I wanted to talk about. It seems to me that leaders in any profession have been shown the way by mentors, and not just one, but multiple mentors. And I was wondering if you could touch base on your relationship with Dr. Kashik and other mentors that you've had throughout your career.
Yeah, I've been very lucky. It's hard for me to talk about Keith. I get pretty emotional. He was a father figure. I had a lot of foot problems as a child, and he said, "Hey, come into the office. Let me take care of you." And after taking care of me, I said, "This is pretty neat." He said, "Stick around." So I literally worked in his office from about the age of 10 on. And when I saw what he was able to do surgically, the ability to help people, even in simple things, kids with ingrown toenails to adults with complex reconstructive surgery. And the fact that he always believed that teaching someone how to do it better than himself changed my entire outlook on life. Forget about podiatry, but the whole idea that if you can find someone who's interested and lead them down the path to doing it better, you help a whole lot more people.
There's no doubt about that. I've heard so many great stories about Dr. Kashik over the years. So you went to the Illinois College of Podiatric Medicine and then came back to Miami, and Dr. Kashik was actually your residency director.
Correct. So when I was in school, unlike today's day and age where there are more slots than students, there were 12 2-year surgical slots in the country. Wow. And no 3-year programs at that time. And Barry University was going to be starting up. Keith was part of that building program. So he knew there needed to be residency programs. So he built a 2-year program outside of a school and said, you have 24 hours to say yes or no. I'll give you the position, but you got to tell me in 24 hours. Mind you, this was a hospital that I had been in and out with him. There were 19 podiatrists on staff. At one time, it was called Doctor's Hospital and owned by podiatrists. Plus, coming from Keith, I knew the surgical training would be exquisite. And the fact that a school would be coming soon, so we would have externs and people to teach, it was a golden opportunity. So I came down. Andy Levy who was in a program in Philadelphia at the time, practiced in Palm Beach, was also a teacher as well, came in and was my senior resident. And the program ran for 27 years, 20 of which I was the residency director after it shifted to South Miami Hospital.
Wow. So as an educator, you've seen this profession evolve yourself. And as a residency director and seen students from all the colleges of podiatric medicine, you've really had a firsthand interest and participation in training these docs. How have you seen the profession evolve over your lifetime to where we are today?
Wow. 35 years. How have I seen it evolve? That's a long answer.
Well, you go from 12 residency slots when you came out. And when I came out in 91, we had 88. So it was already starting to have more positions.
Right. So because of people like Irv Cainett and Keith Kashuk and the folks out on the West Coast from the California school and the folks in New York, we went from a elite ability to get training to training for those who graduated, which that was a big transition because it's very difficult to attract quality students when there's an 80% chance you won't get postgraduate training. I mean, it wasn't far ahead of me that if you weren't one of the top kids in your class, you had to apply for a preceptorship under a doctor who was already in practice to get any sort of clinical exposure. So I think as a profession, we've gone from barely acceptable to world-class in 35 years.
Well said.
I think along the way, though, we've lost some things that may have helped us get to where we are. A more well-rounded education, a medicine-based training. Even in a 2-year surgical program, we spent 6 months out of the operating room learning to be physicians. I think that as the specialty is focused on you're either this or that, whether it's surgical or non-surgical, be a good physician, be a good doctor. If you have the dexterity, the skill, the vision, get the surgical training. I think that we need to refocus on that route of training now, whereas 3 years of surgical training, a 2-year fellowship, and a joint replacement fellowship, you're a great technician. But if you can't figure out what's wrong with the patient to begin with, none of that technical skill means anything.
Yeah, you're climbing the wrong tree.
Right.
Well said. So you have an innate curiosity, Jason, that probably attracted us to do a lot of different projects together, but you took it a step beyond once you got done with your residency surgical training. You did a couple of fellowship opportunities, one at the Hansen's Disease Center in Carvel, Louisiana, and one with the AO Trauma and Fracture Fellowship in Switzerland. A, what motivated you to do that? And B, what's the lasting impression once you were there?
Well, I never want to stop learning. I have this brain that may not function on a high level, but it's always functioning. So if I don't learn, bad things happen. But that being said, the Carville Fellowship came from Irv Picture in Chicago. When I was a second-year student, I had a gentleman with a great toe ulcer. Irv first taught me about offloading, although it was sort of an unacceptable discussion point that you could tell a patient they needed a device to take the force off their foot. Everybody at that time was treating diabetic wounds with betadine and sugar and a pair of extra depth shoes if you were lucky. Irv told me we're doing something wrong here. He had thought processes that he had gleaned from Paul Brand. He mentioned the name. That same patient I treated as a second-year student my first month in clinic with a fourth year, when I graduated, had the same diabetic foot ulcer.
Really?
So I went to Irv and said, we got to be doing something better. We can't keep doing this. And he said, well, here's this book by Paul Brand. So I sought out Paul at the Hansen's Disease Center at the time and went there to learn how to do it better and changed my life professionally, socially, emotionally. The fact that we had this massive epidemic, which is now even worse, and our profession, which was the savers of feet, really had little to no training. I mean, there were no wound care centers at the time.
Right.
You know, in 1989, we opened the first non-university-based wound center at Baptist Hospital after my fellowship at Baptist Health System. So there just weren't no care centers dedicated to diabetic foot ulcers. So spending time with Dr. Brand, spending time with these people that have a disease that they could not get rid of, or even if they got rid of the disease, the ramifications didn't go away till they died, and getting to be forced to be empathetic, which is something, again, I'm not sure we teach enough in our residency programs, and learning the techniques, or at least what Paul thought were the techniques that he gathered from India in providing total contact, providing weight dispersal, protecting these injured limbs. That gave me a whole new focus, not only for wound care, but also for surgery, right? So you think about some of the complex reconstructive surgeries you do. Well, how do you get people ambulating again? Well, in the 80s and 90s, the protective devices didn't have complete contact. They had high areas of pressure. They were encouraging propulsion. Well, wonder why we had such delays in healing. How do you encourage propulsion in someone that needs stabilization? So some of these things that I learned and the way it affected me crossed over not just to wound care. It also gave me an access to the hospital, which at the time, 30 years ago, podiatrists were really only allowed in the hospital to do outpatient surgery or trim toenails. And this gave us an access point to the medical system. We became an essential cog in medical care.
That's right. You know, it's funny, you mentioned Paul Brand and his influence on you, and I have a very similar story, because when I was doing clinical trials in Denver, a good friend of mine was John Boswick, who was a hand surgeon. And he and I would have breakfast every month, and we would discuss clinical trials and what's coming down the pike. And one day I asked him, I said, you know, I'm writing an NIH grant, and I have to find the leader in diabetic foot care in the world to help me acquire an NIH grant. And Dr. Boswick said, well, why don't you just call Paul Brand? And I remember telling him, I said, oh my gosh, you know, I've listened to his tapes and I've read his books. How do I get a hold of him? And literally, John Boswick pulled out his book, wrote the number down on a napkin, handed it to me, went back to my office, closed the door, called the number, and Paul answered the phone. And 30 minutes later, he had agreed to work on a grant with me to help develop some offloading devices. So isn't it funny how all of us have some similar paths and similar mentors?
But once again, it's this mentorship, right? Paul believed in teaching as well, right? Yeah. He didn't keep his knowledge to himself. He didn't, anybody. And when I say anybody that reached out could get access to him, to Carville. He had absolutely never once, in as long as the two of us have known him, did he ever say no to someone.
Yeah, he was unbelievable. Quite very insightful, great stories. In fact, as you know, at Barry University, the Paul and Margaret Brand Research Center is there, right, named after him.
Absolute icon and a human being, right? Which is, you know, you start to see these traits, same as Keith.
Exactly.
These people who lead us all have very similar traits. And one is being inquisitive, one is wanting to do better, and probably the underlying one I find is this human trait, right? Just wanting to help.
Yep, and share the knowledge. We'll swing back around and talk more about Dr. Brand and offloading in a little bit. I was hoping you'd give us some feedback or some discussion about your trauma and fracture fellowship in Switzerland, because in order to be a good wound care doc, you got to be a good surgeon. And you seeked out great surgical training above and beyond your residency training. If you don't mind sharing a couple stories with us about that.
Well, it's an interesting discussion. I am also trained in microsurgery, and my first position as a senior resident and going into my first years in practice was working with a microsurgical team for harvesting toes and doing reimplantation surgery for, traumatically amputated limbs. And one of the big problems we were facing was when you have these traumatically amputated limbs, how do you stabilize the bony parts, right? You spend 16 hours doing nerve and arterial reconstruction. And at the time, the hardware and the thought processes on bone fixation were from 1950. Intramedullary rods, external wires, it's hard to imagine a world without screw sets and, offset lag and all these fancy plates and external fixators and so forth. These things didn't exist. And when you were doing most foot surgery, you could come up with ways you didn't need them. But when you were reattaching a limb, if you couldn't stabilize the bone, you lost the leg. So as I was talking with them, we had done a forearm and a toe to hand transplant on a kid that had a motorcycle accident. And the orthopedic surgeon working with us, I asked him that question. I said, hey, where is the best center? Same question you asked, Paul. Where is the best center in the world to learn about bone fixation? And he said, well, the AO Society is starting these fellowships. Why don't you give Dr. Mueller, head of the AOASI at the time, a call and see if they would consider training podiatrists? So I called, at the time it was Synthes. They put me in touch with Mueller. In the particular program in Switzerland where I had been, they didn't even know what a podiatrist was. So they invited me there. And the whole idea for me was I wanted to learn the cutting edge of fixation while getting exposure to pure orthopedic trauma, level 1 trauma, which at the time was nearly impossible for us in our training. We didn't have the breadth at that time. But that experience was unbelievable. Once again, this is the same type of situation with Carville. Once you demonstrate interest, people are more likely to engage. Once you demonstrate interest in whether you call it homework or a knowledge base, they're more likely to share their knowledge with you, right? So I read every book I could before I got there. I went with a library. We didn't have internet at the time. No one even knew what internet was. But, I went with 6 books on osteosynthesis, including 3 books from veterinary medicine. So when I got there, I could talk the talk. And the folks in St. Gallen were absolute thought leaders, 100% accepting. In fact, they offered me a position to stay on as a teacher before my fellowship was over. It's a really funny story. Being from South Florida, I was walking to the administrator's office to sign a 3-year contract to stay as a head surgeon and clinical researcher. And it was middle of June, started snowing. And I said, this is a sign for a Miami boy. I need to go back home.
That is funny.
Yeah, no, it was a spectacular experience and probably the first use that crossed over between orthopedic, general foot surgery, and wound care was Charcot reconstruction. So the techniques I learned and the ideas all carried directly across. And the, it sounds strange, but, even using multiple screw fixation on simple metatarsal osteotomies just wasn't done. External K-wires, you were really advanced if you clipped a threaded wire off at the bone, maybe cross them, right? Exactly. So the things that we take for granted are what were being developed in those days.
So you came home from Switzerland and you're extremely well-trained, very confident, I'm sure, and went into practice. I'm sure you were training residents. How did you get a foot in the door to do clinical trials and research? Is that more of your inquisitive mind, creating your own world, or did they come to you? How did you work that out?
It's a great question. I actually started before I went into practice. We had a fairly high volume residency program. And in my senior year, one of the surgeons asked what our incidence of post-op infections were in the podiatry section at the hospital. So I went down to medical staff and they directed me to medical records and I asked them and they said, we have no idea. So that just started the ball rolling. And at the time, there was a particular antibiotic that most people were using, let's say excessively before surgery. Essentially, any surgery got 3 grams of this medication before, during, and after, and the patient was on it orally for 2 weeks after surgery. Remembering that some of these, a simple bunion surgery stayed in the hospital for a week.
Right.
So I approached the manufacturer, Jensen, at that time and said, hey, wouldn't it be good to know what the appropriate dosing is to get the best outcome in infections? And they said, well, we have a research facility and people that can help you design that trial. And the moment I saw what went into that, it was like a fish to water. I fell in love with the process. And that was the first paper that came out in late 89, I believe, on antibiotic prophylaxis in foot and ankle surgery, the appropriate timing and dosage of medications.
Wow.
So once that started, the high of finding out answers, right? Coming up with questions, we all can do that. You have a beer, you think of a lot of questions, but actually going down the path and getting an answer, there's a pretty good high involved with that. So once that started, that spawned the clinical research.
I think that's fascinating. It's like the difference between being innovative and then making something happen, and being an inventor, for example. Before we get into entrepreneurship, I wanted to touch base on your Doctors Research Network that you've been running since 1996. Again, that started if I look at your CV, that represents an entrepreneurial venture above and beyond what you were doing yourself, right? And can you mind sharing a little bit about the Doctors Research Network and how it's evolved over time?
Sure. So, well, I will take credit for the thought process behind it, but my wife is actually the brains behind that organization and has been running it since probably 2000. So the whole idea behind Doctors Research Network was once we became known as a clinical research go-to, once my name got published, once our South Miami hospital got recognized, pharmaceutical companies, sponsors, device inventors came to us and would ask us to participate. And when I saw what was out there, these companies were spending a lot of money, and outcomes were being affected by who they chose to participate in the trial. So, and the other part of this, and don't mind my prejudice, was there were no podiatrists, right? So here we had lower extremity clinical trials going on with no podiatrists. So I had a fairly good network of colleagues and friends from, ACAFS and ABPS and APMA. And mind you, this was before ACFS Research Society existed, before AAOS had any real existence in the orthopedic side. So the thought process was we could deliver a better product with high quality wound care, foot and ankle people than what was in the market. And unlike a CRO, site recruiting organization, where we wanted to manage the sites, what we wanted to do was place trials in quality sites and let the sites run their own businesses. And that was the thought process behind Doctors Research Network. And it turned out that after 2 or 3 hiccups, we could pretty much tell who was inspired by doing research and who wasn't. And once you found out who was inspired by the research, the quality was easy to control. So then we started being selected by sponsors and CROs for these placements of the trial. Brilliant. And Doctors Research Network is north of 200 FDA supported clinical trials. So, and just about every big product that's gone through in the wound care space, Doctors has had a play in that. So
that's incredible. So let's fast forward a little bit further and into COVID times. You made a major decision in 2021 to leave clinical practice. And that's founded in your wonderful new company, Defender Operations. Am I correct in that assumption, or how'd that play out?
Yeah, I feel like a history person here. So it's a longer story than that, as you know, because you were intimately involved. So Defender started roughly 13 years ago. And it started with this same discussion that you and I frequently had when you were at Barry University, which was, what are we missing? How can we do better? And the whole idea, right? So I was very active in wound care. Our wound center at Baptist Health was seeing 5,600 wounds a year. So we decided to take a look at our amputation rate. So at Baptist Health System, they have Miami Cardiac and Vascular Institute. They have the wound center. They have a dedicated group of surgeons, podiatrists, infectious disease specialists, hyperbaric medicine, every toy you can imagine, every specialty, really highly skilled people to save diabetic limbs. In fact, it was called the Insensitive Limb Center. We copied Paul when we started in 1989, February 14th, Valentine's Day. So we thought that we were doing great stuff, right? We have all these assets. We're going to be saving legs. Well, we took a look at our amputation rate from 1989 and 90 and correlated it to 2013, 14. And it turns out that we actually were amputating more legs 20 years later.
That's an eye-opening observation.
Well, I came home and told my brilliant wife, I'm going to become a bartender. Here I spent my whole career building this center of excellence, and we're failing. And she said, no, you're not. You're going to fix it. So
I like that.
we hired KPMG and said, take a look at our data and tell us what happened. Where did we go wrong? And after hundreds of thousands of dollars that Baptist Health spent and almost 2 years of time, they came back and said, the problem is diabetic patients don't listen to what you tell them. And I said, give us our money back, because there's no difference between 20 years ago. It's the same, quote, non-compliant patient. So again, I was about this time at SAWC's birthing, I guess. They were just starting to grow. And I'm sitting around with some really bright people, Rob Kersner and Bill Marston and these thought leaders in wound care. And they're like, well, why don't you ask the patients? So we polled 5,000 patients and said, what's going on? Why aren't you doing what we ask? Why do you think outcomes aren't going where they should go? And they responded almost universally. 92% said, we can't. And once again, I felt like a failure, right? How many times do you ask your patient, can you do what I'm asking you to do? Right. Can you stick yourself 7 times a day? Well, I work at a supermarket with gloves on all day long. Of course I can't. And by the way, I can't read.
Absolutely.
So you want me to look at something and follow the instructions. So that whole process really hit home that not only do we need to do better, but we need to include the end user, the patient, not the doctor, not the company making this stuff, but the patient in our decision. 92% of the patients said the devices we gave them, they couldn't physically use. So that's how we started. When we saw that, that's how I said, we have to find a better way. So your question was, why did I make the decision? Well, after, 9 or 10 years of product development based on this same principle, making products that work, that patients can and will want to use. And we hired a fantastic team. We brought in Michael DiTullo, the ex-Nike designer, to help us make products. that looked like things people would want to use, and they wouldn't be embarrassed. That was the other thing patients told us was, when I do what you tell me to do, when I have my wife put these things on me and I go to work, I'm immediately an outcast. And there's a stigma associated with that.
You see it culturally too, in Japan or South America, same thing. It's universal.
Yeah. And until you've been a patient, you don't know the feeling of people looking at you like you're something less because you're ill or have a problem. And it's really humbling. And much like with EZ, anybody that I trained to put on a contact cast, I made them wear one.
We did the same.
Right? So it's not just, this is what it feels like. It's, this is what it feels like to be identified by a product on your body. And these are things we don't learn, right? We're so busy memorizing math and science and statistics, and nobody teaches us the human part of medicine. But at least in wound care, it appears to be the rate limiting step, right? So, you know, the wound healing rate in the United States is abysmal. You guys just celebrated 20 years with the most consistent offloading device in the world. And yet the wound healing rate, you're more likely to lose your leg to a diabetic foot ulcer than you are to heal the wound in the United States. I'm convinced the reason for that is we never engaged the patient in the treatment.
Fair enough.
We never asked, what can we do together to take the force off your foot? What can we do together to keep you from getting an infection? So I think that bit of knowledge is what inspired us to build our company. And I don't know, what are we, 13 patents, 15 more pending, 2 products in market. In 21, what happened was the demand for getting our product to market and actually treating patients was so great, I couldn't do both. I could no longer practice and run and manage Defender. So it was a very difficult decision because I love treating patients and I love the human interaction. But again, it came down to something that one of my business mentors, a friend of mine who is, believe it or not, an arborist, Richard Maxwell, you know.
Welcome back, everyone. 2 weeks ago, when we were filming this segment with Dr. Jason Hanft, we had a lightning strike that put our Cox cable out of commission. So we found a convenient time to reconvene, and we're back. Jason, thanks for making time to get together again.
Thanks for having me back, Jeff. This is great.
No problem. So when we were last talking, you were talking about your transition out of practice into heading up Defender operations full time. Do you want to kind of close that loop, and then we'll get talking about a couple other things?
Sure. So what had happened is things got so busy at Defender, I was torn between still being able to work in the office, see patients, and run the business. There was just not enough time in the day and to do family. So I consulted with a dear friend and mentor of mine. He said, look, which one are you helping more people with?
Good point.
You know, on a busy day in the office, you see 50, 60 people. On a good day with Defender, you help 1,000.
Absolutely. Yep.
So it made the transition a fairly easy, demarcated thing. Doesn't mean I don't miss clinical practice, but it's been a really good transition. I've never worked harder in retirement.
Maybe there's a season for everything in life, you know. Well, that's interesting you say that, because I know with the TCC EZ cast, we know that about each patient gets 7.2 casts, and every year we figure we help between 25 and 30,000 patients to heal. And that's a lot.
You can never do that as a practitioner.
Not even close, right? So I do totally relate to that. That's great. By the way, I've been following you on LinkedIn, and I love all of the Defender information and all the wonderful things you've done with Defender. Would you spend just a couple minutes talking about the Defender product and the design on it? And then after that, I thought we'd talk more about some entrepreneurship details.
So you're talking about Foot Defender, because we currently have 2 products in market, but you're talking about Foot Defender, which is talking about EZ, our offloading protective device.
Right.
And Foot Defender was designed out of a clinical need, much like EZ. After looking at our amputation data at our wound center for 20 years, we found out our amputation rate was actually worse 20 years later. After putting together all of these high-tech skin equivalents and, interventional therapies to get blood supply to a toe, I can stick a wire from your groin to your toe and open up an artery. I can put a contact cast on. I can do all these great things, yet our amputation rate hadn't been changed.
It went up, in fact, based in the diabetes care article from 3-4 years ago.
Right. So about 2 months after our data, the diabetes care article came out, and I said, I don't feel so bad. It's not just me that's no good as a wound care doctor. It's happening everywhere. So we hired an independent firm to look into it, and they came back and told us it's because patients don't listen to what you tell them to do. I said, give us our money back, because in 2018, they didn't listen either.
Right.
So then we hired some experts in the field, brought them in. They interviewed 5,000 patients and asked them why. And the number one thing, 92% of the patients told us was, I'm physically unable to do what you're asking me to do.
Yeah, like try to use crutches and never let the foot touch the ground. It's impossible.
Yeah, even if you're healthy, agile, and underweight, you can't not put your foot on the ground for 4 weeks. It's physically impossible.
Exactly.
Or try to tie the bottom D ring on a cam walker when you're morbidly obese, or maybe you have neuropathy in your fingers and you can't feel the leather strap.
100%.
So that's how we started the design of Foot Defender, using all the stuff very well from casting and how to decrease forces on the foot, slow the gait cycle down, etc. We hired Michael DiTullo, the former Nike designer, and said, hey, Michael, here's what we need to do mechanically. What we want is something that people will want to use, and not only want to use, they'll go, this is easy, and go, aha, I like it. Not, oh no, not another one of those medical devices. And it took 39 iteration, and as you know, almost 10 years. And I used to have hair when we started that process. But we eventually got to the Foot Defender, which is, easy to put on. Patients love it. In fact, in the first 50 patients we used it on in a pilot trial, we couldn't get them back. We only got one. 49 patients refused to return the device. So we knew we were onto something.
Absolutely. So congratulations. And I know how hard you've worked on it over the years, and all the patent work and all the design work and all the supply chain issues. My gosh, if it's not one thing, it's another, right? Like you said, you're working harder than ever, probably. Jason, what is that factor that leads an individual, medicine or not, into the world of entrepreneurship?
Stupidity?
Underestimating the challenge at hand?
Right. Foolishness? No, what it really is, I think, is this desire to solve a problem or to move things forward. Even in simple case scenarios, if you talk to someone who has created something or gone the entrepreneurship route, there's always this underlying solving a problem, answering a question. Even with clothing, right? Take a look at Spanx. There's nothing new about compression garments for women, but the problem was couldn't get them on. They looked horrific and they were unwashable. So solving that problem created a multi-billion-dollar business.
Absolutely. No, I'm with you. I've oftentimes thought when I see entrepreneurship master's degrees being advertised around the country, online and in person, that the real issue with entrepreneurship isn't knowledge. It's your ability to assume risk. Your thoughts on that?
So that's really insightful. I think there are many personalities who think about trying entrepreneurial endeavors. But the ones who are able to tolerate risk or compartmentalize it, because we all feel risk just at different levels, but the ones who can compartmentalize it are the ones who carry things through and get completion and or success. And I think that leads to why physicians and surgeons are so prone to entrepreneurship. our training gives us tools with which to deal with risk. And as we get better and better at dealing with risk, whatever those methodologies are personally or structurally, surgically, we learn to deal with risk by solving the problem at hand. And we don't think about anything else. We don't focus on anything else until the problem at hand is addressed. Then we move to the next step. Very, very similar to entrepreneurship. And once you've built that mental process, it's a very easy crossover.
Well, that's interesting because oftentimes I've thought of entrepreneurship as something that's inherent. You were born with the mentality. But what I'm hearing you say, and I agree with you, is a lot of that risk tolerance behavior is acquired through our training. And that makes sense to me. Plus opportunities.
I think there's some who are innately unable to do it.
Okay.
And they never stray that way. But I think that, I think it's a bell-shaped curve like everything else, right? There's the far left side where no matter how much training and practice, they never get over the fear of failure. And there's the far right side, which I think is where I fall in. I just wasn't smart enough to realize failure was an option.
That's kind of where I've fallen in over the years too, as we've worked on things together. Now that's a good point. So just for a couple minutes, let's talk about structure of a company, because control is an issue, right? You want to develop a product that's going to meet patient needs. In order to do that, you need to get some grants or you need to raise some money. And controlling the company is important because you want to control the product that's going to help the most amount of patients. But in order to get that product to market, there's some give and takes. And the second you raise money, you give up some control. Can you talk about that a little bit?
So unless you are lucky enough to have amassed a fortune in a previous profession or endeavor, the likelihood of being able to fund a project from start to commercialization success is very low. Even with federal funding, even with friends and family fundraising. Giving up control with a goal to that loss of ownership is an expected process in entrepreneurship. Resisting that is much like swimming to shore in a rip current. You will never get where you're going. You just got to go with the rip current until it takes you out, and then you can swim to shore. If you keep pushing against that loss of control, unless you are lucky enough to be financially gifted, it's just not possible, because the expense of research and development, the expense of design, the expense of manufacturing, the challenges that occur between your thought and the ability to get it to market and then penetrate market and sell enough product to support itself, you have to get the funding from somewhere. And if you can give up that control, but bring in people who not only have a check, but can add to the company, right? People with expertise outside your area, whether that be sales and marketing, design, logistics. That's where success, and you really don't lose control, right? If you can bring in someone that's a world-class sales organization person, and that risk is now taken off the table, giving up some ownership isn't a bad thing.
Absolutely. And that's kind of where I was going with it. One person can't be everything. And there's so much talent and there's so many requirements to bring a product to market, as you just highlighted. There's no reason not to bring in those talented people and let them help you.
And I think this is different than being a professional, and something that I see a lot of doctors who have great ideas that never make it to market because they can't take off their professional hat. I got to do it all. I'm the best at what I do. And allow someone who is good at something they have no skill or training in to take the reins and do what they do.
Right. No, I agree with you. When I first started my little company, Metafficiency, I had on the board of directors was an engineer. You may remember Mike Deese. We healed his foot in a cast, and he told me, and we were talking about structuring a company, and the board of board of directors, and he jokingly said, Jeff, board of directors always has to be an odd number, and 3's too many. And I think it was because of his experiences too, right? I mean, he developed software for the Patriot missile and sold it off to Raytheon. So it's a fine line though, right? It's not easy, and you're always weighing cost and benefits, and getting the right people involved.
I agree. And I don't think this is taught in school anywhere, not in business school, not in, post MBA. This is experience. And another reason why I think physicians are really good at being entrepreneurs is life experience gives you that learning. And if you just listen to the life experience, you don't go into the operating room by yourself. You may be the person. You don't go to the wound care center, even with casting, right? You know casting better than anyone on earth. You never put a cast on by yourself. Somebody helped you. Somebody had a skill set that got that patient to the point where you could then cast them.
Absolutely. Well, that brings me to another point, which I wanted your comments on. It's like this optimism that's associated with developing a product to help patients is. It's not always. It's you mentioned earlier, stupidity perhaps, or you said that in jest. I know, but man, that's a big leap initially, financially, time-wise, time away from the family. And we've both done it. I'm always curious to learn from other entrepreneurs how they've managed not just the nuts and bolts of doing it, but time with family, time with your other endeavors you like to do. So
I think it comes down to your family and family structure, right? Obviously, if you don't have kids, it's a different discussion. Personally, in my life, without my wife, it wouldn't have happened. Because as we started Defender, she saw what we were doing, and we sat down and she said, look, we can't keep our life the way we are. I'm 100% behind you. And those are the words she used. I'll take care of the rest. You do what you need to.
Right.
Wouldn't have been possible without that agreement, because there is no harder job, time-wise, energy-wise, than starting a new company with a product that's new to a space. It is truly the adventure of modern business, because you may have a great idea, but that's one of 100 million points that need to happen before the product actually gets into somebody's hand.
Well said. Extremely well said. I agree with you. I think that's why a lot of docs, they'll come up with a concept or, perhaps get a patent, and then they'll just sell it off and hopefully get royalties down the road, as opposed to building the foundation, getting a track record, building the runway, and then benefiting down the road.
For sure. I think that is the best pathway of least resistance to get a product in market. The difficulty is your product is then completely in the hands of someone else.
That's right.
And you know as well as I do that without guidance from the inventor, sometimes things don't go the way they're supposed to. And I, as you know from my history, I have been a victim of that as well, with a fantastic invention that got to who we thought would be the premier end market person, already in the space, already successful, and they just put it on the shelf.
Painful. To this day, I still don't buy those shoes.
So I think that, yes, having others who are already commercializing and in the space do it. Part of Defender as a difference, and I think part of Medefficiency as a difference, was you had a mission. You were a mission-based company. The product was a pathway to achieve a goal, saving legs, healing wounds. Same thing with Defender. There are almost no commercialization partners who are mission-driven.
Good point. It's a real good point. It's quarterly profit.
Right. So to be able to pass that off is almost impossible.
Oh, that's a good point. Well said. Can we touch on another point? Let's talk about intellectual property, because over the years, you and I have done some joint patents, nitric oxide under pressure, and How many hours have we talked with patent attorneys about our products and our inventions? Talk about intellectual property and your take on it and the importance of it.
So there are really two schools of thought. I'm in the one camp, but the two schools of thought are do what you need to do, push as far forward as you can without undergoing the time, expense, and effort to get intellectual property. And then at the last moment, bring in the attorneys and make it happen. The other school of thought, which is where I come from, is if you're truly building an enterprise, if you don't have intellectual property, you have nothing to differentiate you from anyone else.
Totally agree.
So are you gonna put the balance of your entire effort in maybe getting it at the last moment? Or would you rather take the pain up front and build afterwards? That being said, the cost is enormous. Now, you can go online and you'll see quotes about, $20,000 and you can get a patent. If you can get a patent for under $100,000 realized, meaning granted, it's an amazing achievement. And having one patent gets you in the game.
Completely. Well, you can parlay one patent into 5 easily, or 10.
Right. But no, I think it's the lifeblood of a corporate entity with products. It also gives you immediate recognition of validity. Outside companies see it. That's whenever you talk to a company about what you're doing, the second question is, what's your intellectual property look like?
Absolutely.
And unfortunately or fortunately, the patent attorneys have understood this, and their fees are just astronomical.
And you pay for what you get, right? A quality patent attorney is going to cost. It's interesting what you said. So the way you get in the game is to have intellectual property, or you can't raise money. And the way you exit the game with a liquidation event requires intellectual property, or you can't sell it.
Correct. Because you may be able to partner with someone and generate revenue, and they can make profit and you can make profit. But if you're at any point in time looking to exit, if they don't have protection from the world around them, what are they buying?
They don't buy.
Inventory, if they're lucky.
Yeah. Well, you and I fall in the same camp on that. We've been aligned for a long time. Just for the listeners out there, Jason and I have been business partners for a long time, and we actually created a pharmaceutical company that took called Hanft and Jensen put together. And Jason, that working together over the years has been one of the best experiences I've had professionally, and I've always appreciated your insight and your motivation. And I can call you Sunday afternoon and you pick up the phone, and I've always appreciated that. No,
it's not work. Working with you is fun. I truly enjoy it, and we got a bunch more to do.
Oh, absolutely. So, Jason, we could talk all day, of course. You have any final thoughts on entrepreneurship?
Personally, I think it's the most rewarding and challenging event I've ever done, other than having children.
Fair enough.
And if anyone has a teenager, it's about the same experience. You wake up one day and it's the greatest event, and the next day you're like, what happened?
Words of wisdom. I love it. That's the best analogy I've heard ever. So thank you. Jason, thank you so much for sharing your time, your knowledge, and your expertise over the last couple of days. I have not had an experience of weather knocking us out before, but I appreciate you making time to come back on the Dean's Chat.
Absolutely. My pleasure. Anytime, Jeff. I think you're doing great stuff. Keep it up.
Well, thank you. And I also want to thank all of our listeners today for joining us on Dean's Chat, all things podiatric medicine, spending time talking about product development and entrepreneurship with Jason Hanft has certainly been a departure from what we normally do. But I will tell you, we will continue to bring you the leaders and voices in podiatric medicine. And Jason, my hope is that we'll get you back on the show here in the next 6 months or so and follow the Defender operations. I look forward.
Anytime you like.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
Thank you so much.